Hello, I'm Manawoltus, and today I'm going to be talking a bit more about some principles of governance. Today I'm going to be talking about questions of identity. So, specifically in how these things relate to identity and identitarianism and other related issues. So, of course, I know that there are some individuals that speak politically that are a lot in favor of identitarian positions, and then there are some that are very much against identitarian positions. Now, of course, I want to point out something very specific here, and that is that the root of identity is the ego in itself. That is to say, being able to say that you are a person as an individual, distinct from not being a person or distinct from other individuals. In the phrase, I think, therefore I am. Now, this is a phrase that, although it is used commonly as an epistemic proof of one's own existence, does not really apply for the epistemic group of the existence, epistemic proof of the existence of others. Now, of course, the problem with that is that the epistemic proof of the existence of others is something that is really necessary for operating in a society and also for other identitarian positions. Now, I will say, however, that from a realistic perspective, there are certain truths to certain identitarian statements, in that if you were to consider identity as something used to distinguish individuals and groups, then obviously there are, in my view, humans are sexually dimorphic. Now, of course, there are a few people that did not sexually differentiate properly, but additionally, there are different ethnic groups and groups that are genetically distinct from each other. So those are also things that are true. And of course, there's always the nature versus nurture question in relation to those genetic differences and in relation to how big those differences are. Let's say how big the differences in behavior are caused by genetics as opposed to the ones caused by behavior. And of course, in my view, also the difference that I consider the I think, therefore I am question to distinguish individuals to a much higher, that is to say, a much higher magnitude than the question of group distinctions. So, although I understand that there are legitimate reasons to group people and that there are different groups, I think that the difference between individuals is one that is magnitudinally in proportion greater than that of the difference between groups. Now, I could make a little chart showing exactly what I mean, but actually, I'm going to do exactly that. So I'm going to open up Paint here. Uh, let's see if I can get it onto a window. So we're going to use Windows Capture 3 and get Paint on. Bam. So we've got Paint here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a few dots here. So these are individuals, and they are very distinct from each other due to their inability to overcome the ego distinction of I think, therefore I am. Now I'm going to also put some over here, and I'm going to also put some down here. So what I mean when I make the statement that the ego distinction is not very great is if I now do this, and let me make sure everyone sees this very well, and I draw the boundary of the groups. What you see here is that although the groups are distinct from each other, the actual distance between members of the groups themselves is proportionally greater than the distance between the groups. Now, this is not to say that it is less of an absolute distance, because it is a greater absolute distance. However, it is proportionally less. In other words, I view the individuals as being more distinct from each other proportionally than the groups are to each other. I think hopefully people understand what I'm saying. So let me just zoom out a bit in case you can't see the whole picture here. So there you go. You see little dots all over the place, but the distance between the dots, while perhaps not being as great as the distance between those dots and the dots in other groups, is actually a proportionately greater distance than the distance between the groups themselves. And hopefully I've made that very clear at this point. So that being said, where do we then get to the next point here? And by the next point, I of course mean that you reach a point in the development where you have to understand what is it that actually defines your identity. Because if in the way that you first defined your identity of the ego is I think, therefore I am, it is not termed, it is in my nature to think, therefore I am. It is termed, I think, therefore I am. Because if it were in your nature to think, but you did not think, then the statement would be irrelevant, logically speaking. In other words, what I think is important is not so much the inherent qualities, but more how they play out. In other words, you might be hearing a cat in the background. In other words, if I think, therefore I am, then if I do, therefore those are my actions. In other words, here's what the point that I'm getting to. The point that I'm getting to is that you can say everything you want about what someone is likely to do because of that person's inherent qualities. But if that does not match up with what that person is actually doing, then any argument that you're making based on what you think that person is likely to do becomes irrelevant. In other words, let's take this a different direction. Egyptians and the pyramids. Someone built the pyramids in ancient times. For example, you can look at Imhotep, famously believed to be the one that designed the pyramids, at least the earliest pyramids. He's so famous that he later became worshipped. But looking at Imhotep and the other ancient pyramid designers, and then the individuals actually involved in building the pyramids, and then you look at the Egyptians, let's say, at the time of the Romans. They, of course, still had the pyramids. They looked at the pyramids. There were even probably some pyramid shrines that were still being operated, as was the custom, because each pyramid had a little temple attached to it. But anyway, could those people have claimed the achievement of having built the pyramids when they themselves were not actually involved in building the pyramids? For example, in another instance, what if, let's say, your father is a great runner and wins several medals, but you are a cripple? Are you then going to say, look at those great achievements of my lineage? I am from a lineage of proud athletes, when you yourself have very little athletic skill. So it becomes very silly at that point, and that's why I generally am opposed to certain types of identitarianism. Now, then, when it concerns the idea of, let's say, hypothetically, when it concerns the idea of intersectionality. Now, I disagree with the conclusions that the intersectional types make, but I will have to say that they have a point, and that point is, and I'll be very clear on this point, the point that the intersectional types have is that there's more to identity than one aspect. In other words, there's national identitarians, there's ethno-national identitarians, there's civic nationalists who consider the country to be part of their identity. There's patriots, there's religious identitarians, and there are identitarians based on their profession, and there's so many different groups that people place themselves in, or that they find themselves in, and that one's identity, that is to say, the identity that you act upon, that you then play out, is not simply one of these. It is a combination of these, usually. In other words, you might be a father and a son and a husband and a brother. And you can be all of those at the same time. So in that sense, that makes sense to me. So going back onto the idea of inherent qualities as opposed to actioned qualities, because it can be said that some of my actioned qualities are based upon my inherent qualities, but some of my actioned qualities are not based upon my inherent qualities. So then if I move forward from the idea of I think, therefore I am, it makes sense to say that because some of my actioned qualities are based on my inherent qualities, and some of my inherent qualities therefore lead to my action qualities, but some of my action qualities are not based on my inherent qualities, it makes sense to say that ultimately identifying myself based on my action qualities is going to give a better view, or a more complete view, of me as a person, and therefore is more useful as an identitarian principle. In other words, it makes more sense to identify yourself based on the actions that you take and the achievements that you have made, rather than based upon your inherent qualities. Because if you believe that your inherent qualities are important, then they certainly will play into the actions that you take. But if you are not a complete biological determinist, that is to say that if you believe that there is more to a person than simply his inherent qualities, and that people actually make choices in their lives, then you would have to say that it makes more sense to identify yourself based upon your actual achievements and the qualities that you have therefore derived. So what does this mean for government? Why am I talking about this in a series called Principles of Governance? Because this is important in the sense of a government. Because obviously, everybody, as a statesman, if you're building a state, you're going to be very happy uh, about the government that you build if you have a hand in building it, and you're going to be enthusiastic about it as a statesman. But there's more to a state than the statesman. There's also all the other people. So to build patriotism, what you essentially have to do is you essentially have to convince all the other people in the society, well, not all of them necessarily, but you have to convince a significant other part of society that what you are doing is something that is good and useful. In other words, that your governance is a good governance, and it is something that the people can be proud of partaking in. So, this, of course, requires you to, in some way, make an appeal to the people in some way. Now, I have previously mentioned that popular opinions themselves are not logically superior to expert opinions. In other words, in my view, populism doesn't actually lead you to reliably good results. So simply making popular appeals, well, it might be a quick way to get people to agree with your government, is also a very quick way to get people to be disappointed with your government when the government either does not have the resources to follow through on something that the people want, or when the government, by following the actual desires of the people, ends up ruining the lives of the people. Because let's be honest, not everybody is an expert, and that means not everybody's opinions are equally valuable. So, assuming that populism will lead to good results is, in my view, a big risk to take. And any government that is interested in its own perpetuation, which is the first principle a government should have, is to be perpetual. Any government that is interested in its perpetuation will not interact in a manner that will put itself at such a high risk. In other words, populists like to talk big, but ultimately they will end up having to make a sacrifice in order to make things work. So from that perspective, it makes sense to look at the government as something that is not always going to go with the will of the people on this. So how else do you then go about making a government that the people like? Well, you would have to go by following a method that leads to prosperity of the people. Now, of course, coming from the principle of informed ignorance, it's very difficult to actually know what is going to lead to prosperity, because things are always changing and different regions have different interests. And that's why I advocate for decentralization on these things and having a very broad range of abilities for people to make these decisions in a local manner where their opinions are more expert and therefore more useful. So in that sense, that is something that I do advocate for. However, moving on to a different principle, a principle that is more important, does it actually matter if the people like you? Does it actually matter if there is a sense of identity associated with your country? That people are voluntarily saying, I am happy to be part of this country, to the point that this country has become part of me? Well, the answer is a yes and a no. Yes, in the sense that obviously this is going to make it easier for people to run the government, and is going to make it harder for corruption to arise. But on the second principle, you don't really need that. And this is one of my great disagreements with and the reason you don't need that is because the government is predicated on the monopoly of violence. In other words, while violence is something that's good to avoid, you should not pretend as if you're not something that you are. Now, of course, a government operates individualistically in itself as a corporate entity, and it has to. In fact, it does so probably more than the average human being operates as an individual, as exemplified by the principle in diplomacy and in international relations that a country's own perpetuity is more important than the perpetuity of every other country in the world combined. In other words, a country should prefer to survive over every other country in the world combined. Which is not to say that they go out and destroy every other country in the world, but if it means siding against other countries, then the country will have to choose the path of survival over the path of sacrifice, which is something that humans individually are more likely to do. That is to say, take the path of sacrifice, both sacrificing themselves and each other in order to either protect someone or something or serve a greater cause, which a state as an individual is unlikely to do as a corporate entity in that sense. So that is an important aspect of that. Now, of course, that's not to say that a state might not be beholden to superior force, as that does occur as well, but rather that in the absence of superior force, a state will stand for itself before it stands for anyone else. And this is even true for countries that are very I'm really missing my vocabulary today. For some reason, my brain's just half off today. Philanthropistic. How about that? Countries that are very philanthropistic, such as countries that allow large amounts of refugees in. Because the reason why they're allowing the refugees in is not because the people in charge are convinced that it will destroy their countries, because that's obviously contrary to their own interests. But it's because they think that it won't destroy their countries to do that. So when people complain to them, don't you see that this is going to destroy your country? They would say, well, we don't see that this is going to destroy our country, which is why we do this. Because if we did see that this is going to destroy our country, then we wouldn't be doing it. So in other words, the majority of the time, it's unlikely that those people actually have an ill intent. Now, of course, I understand that individuals that are more conspiratorially minded might be of a different opinion than me on this issue, but I at least have to say that that is my opinion currently on that, at least as I understand it. Now, of course, I understand that there are indeed individuals that are trying to undermine countries and that those individuals might gain power. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. What I am saying is that as a rule, a state does not want to destroy itself, because that is the number one rule for a state, is to perpetuate itself. Now, as I was about to say earlier, this goes to one of my big disagreements with the Christchurch shooter. The Christchurch shooter, among other things that I disagree with, and I'm not even going to get into the issue of race in particular here because of something that I actually disagree with even more than race with the Christchurch shooter, something that I think is completely illogical and something that is completely against good principles of governance, and that is his anti-imperialism. Because in my view, imperialism is a tool that a government needs to have at its disposal. And to preclude yourself from the possibility of using that tool is essentially to tie one of the hands of your state behind its back, essentially disarming your country. Because imperialism, and by imperialism I mean the acquisition of new territory and therefore new populations upon that territory is in a way very important for the growth of a country. And what by that I mean that obviously taking a defensive stance is very useful, but at some point you're going to reach a point where it is more advantageous for perhaps strategic reasons or for economic reasons to expand your territory. Now, I'm not advocating for aggressive expansion. I'm not advocating for the idea of waging wars simply for the purpose of conquest in itself. But what I am saying is that if somebody else attacks your country, you might as well take some due compensation if you win. So, in the process of doing that, you can perhaps expand in a way that is advantageous to your economy and advantageous to your strategic interests. Because if, let's say, all the ethnicities in the world separated into little countries, then what if a big conqueror shows up and he starts conquering other countries? Then what are you going to do? You can either stay on your own and simply try to defend your little ethno state, or you can actually fight back and expand so that you can actually begin to rival this big conqueror. And ultimately, my point is that history has shown time and time again that expansion, territorial expansion, is very useful. So to abandon that in principle is essentially to render your country very weak and defenseless. Now, there are a couple of issues related to this. So first of all, what you want to do is you want to not antagonize your own people, because if you strongly antagonize your own people, they're going to rebel and destroy your state, which is something that you don't want happening. So although you have to rule your people with that monopoly of violence to ensure that an order is maintained, you also have to make sure that you don't excessively antagonize your own people. Furthermore, in the actual conquest of other territory, there's a few different things that you can do with the conquered peoples. Number one, you can just kill them all or kick them out of their land, which is going to strongly and extremely antagonize you to them, and potentially is going, depending on the sentiments of your people, might antagonize your own people against you, and is also very likely to antagonize other countries against you. In other words, the number of enemies that you have is going to grow significantly. And that, of course, could be a threat to the survival of your country. So I view it in a sense that you should not make unnecessary enemies, because that's eventually what is going to destroy your country. What is going to destroy your country are those enemies that you've made over generations of doing things to people that they don't like, and they're going to be very antagonized to you. Also, on an ethical standpoint, I have problems with doing that as well. Just in case anybody thought otherwise. But then the second option is to keep them as an underclass. Therefore, having the people be an underclass. But of course, as your country expands, that is going to eventually become a problem where your underclass becomes so large that they're going to look at you, and that it's going to be very easy for people to exploit those divisions that you have with the underclass to eventually overthrow you. And I think a perfect example of this is the social war that happened in the early 1st century BC. In the social war, what you have is the Roman Republic had expanded significantly. They had defeated the Macedonians, they had defeated the Carthaginians, they had expanded into Spain and into Asia, and then suddenly, uh, what you have is the people. Well, not suddenly. This happens over generations, but the way that the state was organized was as a city state, essentially. Rome, for its entire history in the Republic, was essentially a city state that expanded into an empire and still operated under the institutions of a city state, which I think is a very interesting thing to analyze, but I'm not really going to get into that right now. But anyway, you've got the Romans who have the full rights in the Republic. Then you've got the Latins who are very closely allied to the Romans and therefore are almost equal to the Romans themselves. And then you've got the other Italian groups, such as the Soci and other groups. And they are other cities throughout Italy that are allied to Rome, but have different rights in the general republic and the hegemony. And because of their different rights and because of their different economic abilities, they eventually were becoming impoverished by the Romans' advantages due to the rights that the Romans had. And that, of course, antagonized them against the Romans. And after the assassination of a Roman politician who was in favor of extending Roman citizenship toward a lot of these groups, this eventually led to a war where many of Rome's former allies decided to separate themselves into essentially a breakaway republic formed by other cities in a big confederation that went to war against Rome and Rome's remaining allies who had remained loyal to them. And this, of course, was a war that took about a little bit over 4 years and led to a lot of deaths and a lot of violence. And that is something that any country should want to avoid. And at the end, what happened is that the Romans decided to extend their citizenship to the other Italians, and then you never had a rebellion of the same magnitude ever again happen in that area anyway. Now, there's other areas that had problems, but certainly that area had those problems solved. So what you have here is the problem of having a numerous underclass or alter class, because they alter ALTER, in case people don't know how to spell that. That is to say, people that live in a different area of your country that are lower than you in rights, and that status and the consequences of that status. Because if the status itself didn't have negative consequences, then they probably wouldn't have had a problem with it. But because it had negative consequences, in other words, not because of the inherent properties of the law that was harming them, but rather because of the way that the law became actioned out, which goes back to my point, it eventually led to them having strong grievances against their overlords, and then they went to war with them. And then what you have at the end is that the Romans do win, but they decide that the other side actually had a point. And so they give them citizenship. And of course, it's not that simple. The exact way in which they gave them citizenship is a bit more complicated than that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But essentially, what I'm trying to say here is that when you look at the social war, you see a perfect example of a point that I'm making. The point is that if you're going to expand, you're going to have to integrate the populations of the areas that you're expanding into your system in a way that is not going to antagonize them. to you, because that's where you've got where you get other large revolts of either minority groups or underclasses in other societies, and that's something that you should want to avoid as much as possible if you want your country to continue to exist, because the social war could have been the end of the Roman Republic. It could very well have destroyed the Republic, but by not only winning the war, but also fixing the problems that caused the war, the Romans perpetuated their own existence. Now, of course, later on in that century, the Romans would have very different issues that led to very different problems and very different solutions. But the point I'm making here is that the social war is the perfect example of what could happen if things go wrong. So that leads me to the third possibility. Instead of trying to reject or exterminate the people that are conquered, or instead of trying to subdue them, the third possibility is that you treat them the same under the law. Now, of course, that means that if they cause more problems, it means that they're probably going to get punished more and that they're probably going to get arrested more. In other words, I'm not looking for an equal outcome here. I'm just looking for an equal standard. And if you believe that certain groups are superior to other groups, then those groups, in an inherent sense, then those groups should naturally prosper under a system that has equal standards. Because that would only make sense, now wouldn't it? Because if you actually believe that there are certain groups that are better, then it only makes sense that under an equal set of standards, that they should prosper more. And then when the other groups don't prosper as much, they will either adjust to be like the groups that prosper more, or they will not. But then they will not be able to say that they are being oppressed. They will not be able to say that there's an unfair standard and that there's an unfair advantage, because that's just simply the advantage that people have. Because I believe that there are some people that are inherently better at certain things than other people, not necessarily in a racial sense, although it certainly is in certain aspects, such as resistance to sunburns. That's one thing. But let's say there are individuals that are born with disabilities, and those individuals are obviously not going to be as good as other individuals at doing certain things. So it makes no sense to me that then people will harp about this, that, and the other thing when there's all these disabled people that obviously can't do those things, and that the difference in ability between someone who is actually disabled and the abled is greater, in my view, than the difference in ability between individuals of different races. That's my viewpoint, and it's true, objectively speaking. If you're crippled from your genes, you're obviously not going to be as good as walking as anyone else, regardless of what their skin color is. So that makes sense. And if you do believe that the races are inherently different in ability, then under an equal system, they should reach different outcomes. And if they reach different outcomes, then that's fine. And then they can't complain for any unfair system. And if there are a few that do rise above the pack and make it over and actually get above, then shouldn't you be happy for them? Because if you do believe that these things are genetically determined, then doesn't that show that those certain individuals might actually have some meritorious genes? But I'm not that much on the genetic determinism side myself, so obviously I don't think it's that cut and dry. But what I am saying is that this system allows you to do a few things that are essential. It allows you to expand. It allows you to operate without having to worry about major rebellions, and it allows you to not antagonize a large number of people. And I think all those three things are very good things. Now, what it doesn't allow you to do is to create a very unified identity. But that's what the state is for anyway. You don't need an identity to hold the people together. What you need is a strong state. Because what I see historically is that these identities, that national identities that are created, are not created by, let's say, it's not that people have an identity and then they form a state on the basis of that identity. That's something that happens very rarely in history. There's a few examples. For example, Israel today is an example of that, but it's actually very rare historically. It only is something that became more common more recently in history, as in the 19th century, people started leaning more on the identitarian side, which they hadn't in centuries before. What you see, though, is for most of history, it's the state that establishes its power, and then based on the state's power, based on the glory of the state, based on the state's ability to exert its authority, and based on the people's love for that authority, that's where you get the national identities that build up. And of course, within the state, you have the genetic background and makeup of the future of the state, and as that mixes together and grows as time passes, that becomes the ethnicity of the state. So a great example would be England. The English people aren't all from one genetic background. They come from, some of them are descended from the French, some of them are descended from Normans. You've got Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, Frisians even. You've got some Celtic admixture, and you've got Scandinavians, Danes, and all that. And those are all different ethnic groups. But they got together under one kingdom and over time became one ethnic group. And that's the process of ethnogenesis. Ethnogenesis is not determined in a very clear branching sense, as one might expect, that you've got a father, he's got 5 sons, and each of the 5 sons then have their sons, and then as those expanded in their broader families, they become the different countries. Although that is something that does happen, is not ultimately the only way ethnogenesis happens historically. Ethnogenesis is something that takes time and it takes centuries, and it largely involves individuals being under the same jurisdiction and therefore operating in the same society. A great example would be the ethnogenesis of the Italians, caused, in my view, by the results of the social war, where after that is when we actually, for the first time, see what you could call a unified Italy, where all Italians now are under the same law and have the same rights, and therefore can marry each other, and that eventually, all these different tribes coming together, leads to the ethnogenesis of the Italian people. And you see this historically over and over again in many different places around the world. So to then say we need to be 100% on our specific ethnic group is a bit silly, because your ethnic group probably, in most cases, didn't simply originate from itself, but is actually a merger of several other ethnic groups, not caused by um, ethno-nationalism in its own time, but rather caused by the ability of rulers and the ability of the state to unify a coherent region under its jurisdiction. And that eventually leads to ethnogenesis. In other words, a successful state will eventually produce its own ethnogenesis from the people that live in it. And we can see this happening in a younger state, for example, the United States. There's people in the United States that no longer identify themselves as being ethnically English, Irish, Scots-Irish, Scottish, Italian, Jewish, or whatever, but actually identify themselves as American on as their ethnicity. And what you have there is an ethnogenesis of the American people. The American people not simply anymore being a people of composed of different groups that have come together, but and being under one country, but rather by being under one country and by being proud of the country they're in, they ethno generate themselves as the American people. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best thing in the world or that it's the worst thing in the world. I'm just saying that it shows a love for the country and it shows a success of the country. And that therefore it's on the chicken and egg question of ethnogenesis and of the state. I place the state before ethnogenesis because that is where ethnogenesis usually derives from. It is from the state. That's where you have the German nationalists in the 1800s form one Germany out of different tribal groups that speak different languages uh, that existed and still do exist to some respect. So that they might have some commonalities, but the commonalities that they have are largely determined by their shared history under a state. So there you go. And, and that's why then the Franks had a different history, and that's where you get the Dutch from. But anyway, tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that ethnicity should be more important? Do you think that having an identity is something that you should have before creating a state? Or do you think that ideally it is something that is derived from the praxis of the state in itself? Tell me what you think, and I'll be seeing you all next time on the Vultus over and out.